Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, everybody. I am Judy Friedman Kadish, the director of Americans for a Safe Israel. Our mission is to do everything we can to educate about the need for a safe and strong Israel. And of course, we believe that in order to have a safe and strong Israel, it must be a whole Israel, including what sometimes are called the disputed territories of Yehuda and Shomron. And of course, we would love to see Gaza back into the Yesha fold. We take 2 trips a year to Israel. We send out newsletters twice a week. We've been hosting these Zooms that have been very meaningful, bringing you, the news of the moment from Israel. And we're just really happy to see many of you come back again and again, and some new faces as well. So again, welcome to our Zoom series, Americans for a Safe Israel. Today, we are really honored to have, well, I guess the title of today's program is The Assault on Israeli Democracy by the Legal Establishment and the Media. And we have with us Moshik Kovarsky. He's a member of the Project 315 Steering Committee, and he is a 5th generation Israeli residing in Central Israel. He served in the IDF Intelligence Corps, during which time he won prizes. And he ended his service as a major, now retired. Moshik is a successful high-tech entrepreneur who finalized 2 successful startup companies, venture capital exits. And today, Moshik is an active volunteer, along with a group of Israeli citizen patriots, working on the 315 project. You can find that, we'll put it in the chat box later, but if you want to know more about it, there's a website, www.the315.org. Their mission is to dismantle the false indictments against former Prime Minister. There's so many parallels, as we'll talk about later, against former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, working tirelessly to tell the story. The project is exposing the evidence of the coup in Israel by the legal establishment and the media in Israel, and the current sabotage of democracy. Moshik is married. He's a father to 2 daughters, like me, and a grandfather of 5. I'm still waiting. He won the Rothschild Award for Industrial Development. He does a lot of volunteer work, including teaching mathematics at high school, and is also the chairman of the Atlas Committee that is in charge of finding the best high-tech companies in Israel. So without further ado, I give you Moshik Kovarsky. Moshik will speak for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes. There's time for questions afterwards. Please put your questions in the chat box and confine what you put in the chat box, if you could, to questions. Thank you so much. There you go, Moshik.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Actually, good afternoon to you. Good evening to me. Glad to speak to you with Israel. I'm sorry it's not in a more pleasant opportunity to talk of the achievements. I'm going to speak about a subject which may be a little bit distressful and distressing, and I apologize for that. But we need to know the facts. Truth has to come out, and we need to tell it like it is, and hopefully bring about the change that is important for everyone, putting democracy back on track. And hopefully, it is my personal perspective to bring Benjamin Netanyahu back to power as the Prime Minister of Israel, with a proper right-wing government that can actually perform a right-wing policy, which I'm sure everybody on this call identifies with. So I'm going to give you a timeline. I'm going to shorten it a little bit compared to what I usually tell people, because in Israel, I go into much more details. But I will try to take you over the last 7 years, what brought us to the point today where suddenly Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the ubiquitous prime minister of Israel for the last, for 12 years actually, is no more the prime minister. I will describe it, and then you can decide whether this was achieved in truly democratic means, or was there a coup, not by the force of tanks, but the forms of lawyers and by the forms of TV studios. And I will give you the facts, I'll give you the timeline. You're welcome to go and research it. It's not so easy because sometimes the media doesn't give the full picture, but let's start. So a little bit of history. Netanyahu was the prime minister of Israel for 2 separate periods. The first period was between 96 and 99. That was when he was still young, a bit inexperienced. He did great things to Israel. In retrospect, when we look over this period, a lot of very, very good changes have happened, including, and that's probably dear to everybody's heart here, the actual stopping of the Oslo Accords, which were on full track and were about to tear Israel into 2 states. And Netanyahu, during the Clinton years, managed to slow down the process, almost bring it to a stop. But then we all know what happened, the media blitz, smearing, and it affected many people. I can say I was still young. It even affected me at the time. I believed him at the time. And then he lost the government to Ehud Barak. We all know how that ended up, not very good, with the Intifada, the second Intifada, explosion of buses and the terrible massacres that happened after that. And then came Sharon, and he was a prime minister. He was replaced by Ehud Olmert. And then in 2009, fortunately, Netanyahu was re-elected and instated a stable right-wing government which lasted 4 years. In 2013, there was another election, and he won again, but he had to form a coalition that included the 2 that are now in power, Bennett and Lapid, then their first term. And this government lasted for 2 years. And that brings us to the 2015 election, where our story actually starts. So that was just the prologue. So 2015, I remember it very well, was a very tense election. The main opponents of Netanyahu at the time were Tzipi Livni and the person who is now the president of Israel, Bougie Herzog, Yitzhak Herzog. And they teamed up against Netanyahu. They formed like a duo that was supposed to depose him. And the Labour Party under a new disguise called the Zionist camp, they were fighting Netanyahu, and for a while it looked like they're going to win too, because all the polls show that they are ahead by quite a comfortable margin. They received help by a supposedly non-political organization called V15, standing for Victory 2015. Later we learned that V15 was funded partially by the US government at the time of Obama. That was discussed in a Senate hearing later. At the time we didn't know that. There were some suspicions, but it wasn't a known fact. They claimed not to be a political organization because they didn't support any candidate. They supported the fictionary government, the fictionary candidate of Just Not Bibi. That was the candidate that they supported. And despite all the predictions, despite all the smearing campaign against his family, the housekeeper that was not happy with Sarah Netanyahu, the janitor that was very upset about things that were told him to do at home. All this went to the media in full-fledged, but it didn't affect the public, and Netanyahu won. He won convincingly in 2015 and managed to form a coalition, first of 61 members of parliament, and then adding Avigdor Lieberman, it became a 65 and pretty stable government, which lasted between 2015, March, when he won, until 2019, when we had another election. So 4 years, that's in Israeli terms, it's quite a long period for a government to act. And this period was actually very fruitful. Halfway into this period, we had a change of administration in the United States, and President Donald Trump took over. And that was, I think, the honeymoon of Israeli and US relationship. Together with President Trump, Netanyahu managed to achieve significant things politically, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem, including marginalizing the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, including recognizing the Golan Heights as a sovereign area of Israel, recognizing Jerusalem, and of course, later on, the deal of the century and the Abraham Accords, but that happened after 2019. But all in parallel, there was a growing movement of, I would call it the deep state, which it really is, to depose Netanyahu, because it was quite a shock to the left that Netanyahu managed to win in 2015. They were sure that they have it within reach, and then he won convincingly. So they realized that they cannot depose him by the will of the people, and instead they have to depose him using legal and media means. They also realized that going after his family will not cut it. They have to go after him personally. They have to go after him not on trivial issues like what meals he's eating and what bed he has on the plane that he's going to meet world leaders, because that was basically what happened before. They have to try to attack him and to indict him on matters of national policy, significant matters. And they marked 4 items, 4 areas where they wanted to attack him. 2 of them they succeeded, 2 of them they didn't. One of them was the communication infrastructure of Israel. They try to show that he's doing this for the personal gain of his friends who are tycoons. We'll get into this. This has become the 4,000 portfolio. They try to show that he's trying to take over the media, that he is trying to silence the opponents in the media and basically control what is said. I'll discuss this in a minute, but this has become the 1,001 and 2,000, the 1,000 and 2,000 portfolio. They tried to indict him on the matter of the gas explorations, where they totally failed, because Israel today enjoys the enviable position of being independent from the point of view of gas resources, which happened because of Netanyahu's very, very decisive actions together with Minister of Energy Yuval Steinitz, and they managed to get the gas out of the ground and get to the point where even the world leader Chevron has bought Nobel Energy, which was the gas company that discovered the gas exploration in Israel, and thus has become an investor in Israel. Remember, Chevron for many years succumbed to the boycott. So that was a major achievement there. And the 4th issue they tried to attack him was on the security area, on the submarine business, something which we lately completed a research, and I can tell you, there's nothing further than the truth than to blame Netanyahu from any personal gain in this issue. It's totally bogus accusation, and I can say this from now from point of view of really knowing the details. But we won't go into that tonight, because that's a whole subject by itself. On the first 2 issues, let's start with the media. Netanyahu is an avid supporter of an open competition on the media, a free market of opinions. That was always his policy, and unfortunately, it's very hard to do this in Israel. There is a sort of a duopoly between 2 TV channels, 12 and 13, which are now sharing basically until lately. There's been some changes because of Netanyahu's action, but until lately, this is like a full liberal biased channel with very, very few voices from the right. And on the print business, on the newspaper, there was Yediot Aharonot, which was a monopoly, declared monopoly. And Netanyahu, together with the late Sheldon Adelson, has managed to open a competitor, Israel Today, which took over from Yediot Ahronot monopoly. And that has made Noni Moses, the owner of Yediot Ahronot, a mortal enemy to Netanyahu because it really hurt him also in his pocket. So Netanyahu wanted to open the media. He wanted to cancel the state broadcasting authority, which in this day and age, with all the cable channels and all the possibilities through the internet, doesn't really have a room. And that faced strong opposition. He also wanted to cancel the IDF army station, which again, is kind of a remnant from the times Israel was founded and is not needed anymore. And all this bought him a lot of enemies. And on the legal establishment, we have, and that's a subject for a whole lecture by itself, how the structure of separation of powers between the judicial, the executive, and the legislative authorities were totally shaken. The balance was shaken by actions that were carried out by Supreme Court Chairman Aaron Barak, and you may have known the name. Over the years, he piece by piece took over the independence of the executive and legislative branch. And his famous statement is that everything is judgeable. Everything can be judged by the court, including policy matters, including subject like that you wouldn't dream to be in the United States to be judged by the court. And he basically, the term that I heard many times on the Supreme Court judges hearing, the term that has become kind of like a bad name, to legislate from the bench. That's what they do all the time. They legislate from the bench. And they basically made a rule that it doesn't matter what the law says, it's what the judge thinks that was the intent of the law. And that's how we are where we are. So his efforts, I would say very flimsy effort to make changes in this respect, also won him I would say hatred is a strong word, but the rivalry of the legal establishment. So all these forces, all these powers were determined to stop Netanyahu and not let him go ahead with his plans. So that's kind of the background. So what happened? So over the next 4 years, between 2000, we'll divide it. It started in 2016. The method was simple. On the personal behavior thing, let's find all the people that are surrounding Netanyahu and try to find things about them, things that don't relate to Netanyahu, things that some transgressions that they made. A famous case is a guy named Ari Harrow. He is an American Jew who came to Israel at the age of 16. He is quite Zionist, nice person. He became the chief of staff of Netanyahu. He was actually 2 terms with Netanyahu, one earlier in 2010. And the second one, he was the chief of staff in 2014 to 2015. And in between, he founded a strategic consultancy firm called 3H Global. And when he became, again, the chief of staff, he sold it to a couple of nice American couple. And when he was done with his job in 2015, they basically canceled the deal and he got back into his company. And they took him to investigation on the suspicion that it was all a fictitious deal, that he didn't really sell his company. and he used it for access. I mean, he used this position for access. I'm not sure. I cannot give an opinion whether it was right or wrong, the accusation, but I can assume that arresting him for this was in an effort to get something on Netanyahu. And we know that from the actually transcripts of the investigation, because they tell him, we are not going to tell you, we're not going to ask you a question. You've been around Netanyahu. They even use the name. You've been around Netanyahu. You know what's right and what's wrong. Just tell us what you saw that was wrong. It was a fishing expedition if you ever seen one. And this is in the transcripts. I'm not inventing things. And the guy tried to sustain the pressure, but he was threatened on his personal freedom, on his money. Eventually, and we don't know yet how, they found in his computers recordings of two conversations between Netanyahu and Noni Moses, the editor of Yediot Ahronot. And a little bit background on this. Yediot Ahronot, as I said, was a fierce competitor of Israel Hayom. Noni Moses, after the 2013 election, when Netanyahu had a less powerful coalition, Noni Moses tried to pass a law that will block Israel Hayom, Israel Today, by forcing it to charge money. Israel Today was a kind of like a metro paper that was given for free and made its money from advertisement. But that hurt Noni Moses a lot. So he wanted to pass a law that will forbid a paper for being distributed for free. And that law was gathering power in the government because the coalition, even the parties that were in the coalition, were against Israel Today because they perceived it to be a pro-Bibi newspaper. So Netanyahu was really trying to stop this law from coming to action, and he knew that all the marionettes in the Knesset will not stop it. He needs to go to the source. So he went to talk with Noni Moses. They had 6 conversations, only 2 of them recorded, number 4 and number 5. And these recordings performed by the request of Netanyahu. By the way, in Israel, it's okay. It's legal to record a conversation if you are a participant. It's not against the law. So he recorded a conversation and wanted to hold them in case he loses the following election in 2015, and he's going to, and Moses is going to try to pass the law. He will put the recording and say, here, that was his real intention. That was the reason he recorded it. But he won the election. The law didn't come through. But then a year later, during this arrest of Ari Haro, they found these tapes, and they decided to make it a case, the case 2000 against Netanyahu. So this is supposedly a case where he is indicted for breach of trust. I don't know which trust he breached, maybe Noni Moses' trust, but that's not the intent of this felony. And Moses himself is accused of trying to give a bribe to Netanyahu, like giving him, the bribe is not money. The bribe in this case is just good coverage, which is a world precedent. It was never done before that good coverage is considered to be a bribe gift. And that is the story here. That's also, by the way, the story of the 4000 indictment we'll get to. Good coverage as a bribe. So no money. We're not talking about money. We're not talking about anything that consists of bribe, just good coverage, which never happened, by the way. He never got good coverage. This is a joke. So that was the 2000 indictment. But just to give you an idea how they took a person, a Zionist person, a good person, and basically blackmailed him into becoming a state witness against Netanyahu on this false accusation of bribe. In the same time, they got a lot of gossip from a lot of newspaper people who really didn't like Netanyahu, and they started to investigate everybody around him, including the famous producer, which you may know, Arnon Milchan, who is big in Hollywood. He was a personal friend of Netanyahu from the 90s. They had a lot of talks unrelated to politics, a personal friend of the family. His daughter was a friend of Sarah. They were frequent house guests. And he hardly had business in Israel. Yeah, he held a little bit of a media company, Channel 10, which was fledgling. But they are blaming Netanyahu for taking, sit tight, cigars. That's the blame, that he took cigars from Amnon Milchan that brought sometimes cigars to Netanyahu and sometimes champagne bottles to Sarah. And what did he give in return? Well, they don't blame him for bribing, they don't indict him for bribe in this case, although they were threatening Milchan too, that they will indict him for bribe. And for 3 cases, I won't go into all the details. 2 of them didn't really happen. It has to do with access to, with some ideas about purchasing another TV channel. You know, just an example, Milchan was at the past in the 80s, there are rumors, and he doesn't deny them, that he helped the Israeli Mossad in certain actions. And that was way back in the 80s. Since then, he came to Hollywood, he became a producer, he didn't touch it anymore, he didn't do anything of the kind. In 2013, he's still an Israeli citizen with an American green card. And he was trying to extend his visa, his green card visa, and he ran into problems with the US government because in an interview shortly before that, he mentioned that he was once doing some of these activities. So they wanted to stop him from getting the visa. And he came to Netanyahu and said, all I want you to do is to tell the then ambassador in Israel, Dan Shapiro, that I'm not doing these things anymore, that I'm not involved in anything security mechanism of Israel for the last 20 years. And this is like a basic decency for a prime minister of Israel to do this for a person who was once very supportive and very helpful to Israel. So he picked up the phone and called Shapiro. And then maybe he talked to John Kerry at the time. So this is what they blame him for, doing things which were like out of the ordinary. Ridiculous, pretty ridiculous. But the main indictment, this is the 1,000 case, by the way. The 4,000 case is the most ridiculous one, where Netanyahu is actually, they try to very strongly squeeze a bribe allegation, and they made him responsible for helping his tycoon friend, his name is Shaul Alovich, with regulatory actions concerning the biggest communication infrastructure company, Bezeq. In return, Bezeq, this company had a very marginal, non-important website called Walla.com. Walla is like Yahoo in Israel, but it's not as popular as Yahoo. And they say that Netanyahu actually controlled Walla, that he actually controlled what is being published there in return for this regulatory action over a period of 4 years. And that's where we came into the picture, the 315 project. I'll tell you about it in a little bit. So, these are the 3 cases, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000. Jumping forward to 2018, they managed to enlist 3 straight witnesses. One of them is this guy, Ari Hara, I mentioned. 2 others were a guy that was the general manager of the communication ministry, a guy named Shlomo Filber. And the 3rd one was a guy who was the communication director for Netanyahu. His name is Nir Hefetz. These witnesses told them, we have nothing to give you, basically. We don't believe there was a bribe. We don't believe there was anything non-kosher there. But they recruited them anyway. And why? First of all, they put really bad leverage on them. On Hefetz, they tortured him, actually tortured him. It was published in court over the last several months. The stuff that he went through, it's all on video. It was screened in court. Unfortunately, they don't release it to the public. But the people, my friend Adi, who was in court at the day that they showed the videos, she said she didn't sleep all night. This guy was flea bitten in his cell. They prevented his medicine. They prevented his food. They prevented sleep. They brought a person which he was personally involved with for no reason, just so he will see her and he will know that his family is being threatened, that they're going to ruin his family. And they told him to this effect, we're going to ruin your family. They held him in arrest for 14 days, a normative person with no criminal record. And at the end, he succumbed and became a state witness, but he has nothing to give them. His testimonial was more going better for the defense than for the prosecution. And Nir Hefetz and the other two were recruited for one purpose only, to convince Netanyahu that he has to retire. If he would retire from politics, they would cancel the allegation the same day. They were not interested in putting him in jail. They were interested in pushing him out of politics. And that was in March 2018 when they announced the 3 witnesses. And there were articles in the media where they say, this is the time for you to retire, Benjamin Netanyahu, because you have too much evidence against you. And he said, no, I will stay because, first of all, because I want to take care of Israel. And second, because I think I'm innocent. I don't think these things will stick. And he stayed. And then, but his partners to the coalition, people like, and it all goes back to the time, the end of 2018, when Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, already then, has formed a new right because she was the justice minister at the time. She was in very good relations with Attorney General Mendelblit, who was behind the whole scheme. And she heard the word that Netanyahu's days are numbered, and they were ready to prepare themselves for the day after. And same thing with Avigdor Lieberman. He left the coalition sometimes toward the end of 2018, and the Knesset was dismantled, and we went to another election earlier than planned, instead of the end of 2019, in April 2019. And then started a big barrage, what we call the real peak of the coup. Because when Mendelblit, the Attorney General, heard that there's going to be an election, he went to his council of ex-Attorney General, ex-judges. They sat in hiding, and they all told him, go for it. Put a pre-indictment before the election so the public will be convinced that they cannot elect a person who's going to be convicted. And at the same time, they started to release a barrage of information from the investigation room, transcripts, transcript from internal discussions. All the reporters on the wrong side knew what happened inside the investigation room and inside the discussion rooms of the Justice Ministry, of the prosecution, before any of this material was even released to the defense. So it was all in the public eye without Netanyahu having any way to defend himself. And any attempt to say this is not right, it shouldn't be leaked, came with the fierce opposition saying that he is destroying the rule of law, that he is daring to say that somebody is doing it for the wrong reasons, etc., etc. So we went into an election. Actually, 40 days before the election, they submitted this pre-indictment writing, what we call the suspicion writing, and he had no way to defend himself because he didn't have any of the material that they based it on. Now we know that it was mostly false, but at the time, people were convinced. And despite all this, and despite of all these vicious leaks, the right wing, excluding Bennett, excluding Lieberman, won 60 out of 120. We were missing one mandate to form a right-wing government. And I'm convinced, and so are my team, that if we didn't have this unfair and vicious campaign of leaks, we would have at least 5 more mandates and we would have a stable right-wing government that would do wonders for Israel. So there you have it. That's when the coup really happened. So Netanyahu didn't win, but he also didn't lose. It was like a tie. And we went into another election at the end of 2019. Before that, there was a hearing. After the suspicion writing, there was a hearing, and they didn't give him, he said, let's have the hearing open. Before going to court, before they submitting the full indictment, they give him a hearing. He said, I'd like the hearing to be an open door so everybody can hear what I have to say too. They refused. They said, this is a populist thing that he's doing. He tried to bring legal scholars from the US, Nat Levine and Professor Avi Bell from Harvard, and it was signed by Alan Dershowitz and Richard Heidman. They gave them 30 minutes. It's a mockery. And only towards the end, until the end, they didn't tell them if they'll even have a time to hear them. And in the middle of the hearing, the main attorney that actually signed on the indictment left for a safari in Africa. They're affecting the fate of the country, and she goes for a safari in Africa. And after all this, there was just before the hearing, there was an election, again a tie. Then we had another election in 2020, like 3 in a row. In 2020, it was already when the COVID started. And after the election, where it was again a tie, Benny Gantz has decided to join the government, and we had a 1-year government with Netanyahu and Gantz together. And that fell apart because all through this time, there were huge left-wing supported demonstration next to his house in Jerusalem. They blocked street. They had all kinds of disgusting displays, including really sexual scenes. And the media was supporting them. They were giving them full court on their studios. All the demonstrations were published and they were broadcast live. And the neighbors were complaining, we don't have day, we don't have night, we don't have peace. They went to court. The Attorney General Mendelblit said, no, they should demonstrate. This is their legal right, in front of his house, in front of all the neighbors. And it was like a madhouse. And during the COVID, against all regulations, they were opening tables and eating there, pretty disgusting. So after all this, we went into another election in 2021. And this 2021 election, against all the time leakings, all the time media blitz against him, he again ended up with a tie, almost a tie, because then current Prime Minister Bennett defected together with Gideon Sa'ar. They betrayed the ideology. They betrayed their vote. Well, at least Bennett, I can say, betrayed also his voters, because he stood there and said, we will never, ever look at my eyes. I'm looking at you. It's all a spin. We're never going to sign a government with Yair Lapid. We're never going to sign a government with the left. We're never going to sign a government with the Arab parties. Netanyahu is just lying. Well, we all know who lied now. So that's how it happened. And the last 9 months, we've had this flimsy government who is, you can already see the cracks. And now about the 315. So we all formed about the time that the trial started in April of 2021. And the reason we called 315 is because when they submitted the indictment in the pre-trial, the lawyers of Netanyahu said, look, you're blaming him of bribe, but you cannot tell where did he get a bribe? What exactly good coverage he had? If we want to see the cases, you can't just say there's a forest, you have to show the trees. It's a criminal case. So the court agrees and sent the prosecution to fix this. And they came out with an appendix with 315 items where Netanyahu supposedly got unusual acceptance or exceptional response from the owners of Walla to publish things that he wanted to publish, or to remove things he wanted to be removed, or to change things he wanted to be changed. And we, actually, my friend Guy Levy, who was from Beersheba, picked up on one of these items and saw that it's totally false, that there's nothing exceptional about it. It was published everywhere. It's like a spokesman message. There's nothing unusual. And then he said, I want to do it for all other 314 items. And he called me and said, will you help me? I said, sure. As Judy mentioned, I do a lot of volunteer work, but I agreed to help him because I supported the cause, and recruited 2 more people and about 100 volunteers. And we divided the work between them. We gave each one like 7 items, or it was 50 at the time volunteers, gave them 7 items, 6, 7 items. We collected all that they returned. We normalized it. We put it into a spreadsheet. We put it into a PDF. We talked to the lawyers. they are not allowed to ask us things, but we're allowed to come to them and tell them what we found. And it became, and after that, you know, when the court hearing started, and the witnesses started to march, and the picture started to look totally different than what it was in the indictment, we followed up with the discussions, and we published it. We made like short video movies in Hebrew that described all these cases of the 315, and it became a phenomenon, you know. When we come now to demonstrations, and we had one last week, it's like we cannot cross the street. People are stopping us, and they're like amazed at what we did. They said, people come to us with tears in their eyes. They say, you opened our eyes. Without you, we wouldn't even know what the truth is. And talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands of people now that are really, and it's a lot for Israel, that are really very well versed about what's going on. And that may be our only chance to beat this, because the judges, as much as they hold loyalty to their friends in the prosecution, they also care a little bit how they are shown in the street. It's a totally different system we have here. It's not like in the States where it's so public. So maybe this visibility is going to help. Plus, of course, the wonderful work that the lawyers are doing. They're really doing exceptional work. So here you go. We gave you like a very short description. You believe me, if I wanted to, I could speak about it for another 5 hours, but let's open it to questions, and I'll be happy to answer anything you ask.
Thank you. That was really, really wonderful, and really eye-opening. I'm going to start off with a question or two, and then we do have some very good ones from the audience. As you mentioned, in 2015, Obama sent his V-15. Is there any action? Is there any indication that there were foreign actors in this, or was this totally an Israeli coup?
Well, it's kind of complicated, because the Israeli V-15 was part of, actually was a sub-organization of another organization that was formed before. I don't want to mention names right now because I don't have it in front of me. I don't want to sin toward some people who are not connected, but I have some names in mind that I know. And the roots come from the United States. And it's maybe originally not a political organization per se. They had their opinions, of course, but they were not supporting a party. But then during the election, it became quite politicized. And it was brought to the election committee to forbid their action. And they claimed that because they not support any particular candidate, they cannot be held as a political organization. They were against someone, not for someone. And that kind of excludes them. And again, the judge that heads the committee is an ex-Labour Party in the past, before he became a judge. So he was quite favorable to them.
Okay. And then you also talked about the Israeli police using like very, very harsh, to say the least, methods against certainly what was his name? Neil Hefez?
Neil Hefez.
Who authorized that, and how did they? Who authorized it? Who authorized the budget for that? Who authorized the people to do that? Okay. Have you been able to trace that back?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because I can talk a little bit about it. So in 2015, December, by the time this whole madness started, there was a new police commissioner appointed. His name was Roni Al-Sheikh, the general police commissioner. He was actually not the originally suggested candidate. Another candidate was suggested, who was an ex-general in the army. He was kind of an outside appointment, and that was not seen very well by the police. The police didn't like the fact that they're bringing somebody from the outside. And very soon after, he found himself under indictment himself. and he's still fighting his innocence to this day. In the meantime, he got cancer. His name was Gal Hirsch, General Gal Hirsch. He was brought to make the police a better organization. When this failed, and they invented something on him, which later on fell apart, but doesn't matter, his life was ruined in the meantime. And we have a suspicions who did it. There are some whistleblowers from the police that came out and said it, and they were neutralized as well. So after he was intercepted, they brought Roni Al-Sheikh from the security service. And he came from the Shabak, the Israeli security service, with a full arsenal of method that they operate on terrorists. And he built a massive organization within the police. And that's right now under investigation. They're not full conclusion yet, but you may have heard about the latest spyware in Israel, which also draws parallel to a similar spyware that's happening in the States, except here it was organized by the government. There are a lot of cover-up attempts here too, by the media and by the Justice Department, but the truth is going to come out. They have a whole unit of cyber and SIGINT sitting in Jerusalem with 500 people that bought the Pegasus software. I guess you heard about the Israeli NSO company called the software called Pegasus that actually installs spywares on people's phones and computers in order to retrieve all the information within. And Roni Al-Sheikh, today, he is trying to say that there was nothing of the kind, but we're still in, until the truth comes out, I will not comment further, but it's being investigated, including in the actual trial of Netanyahu, where the lawyers are saying that they have information that some of this was achieved in using these methods. So the Israeli FBI, if you may, it's called Unit 433. At one point, there were like 500 or 600 police people and investigators just on the Netanyahu case. That's almost 50% of their manpower. Forget the Arab crimes, forget everything. They were gung-ho to indict Netanyahu. And everything was kosher to the cause. I mean, the cause justifies the means in this case. And they were escorted through the time by the lawyers from the Justice Department. Now, some of these investigators were brought to court and testified that everything they did was under the supervision of an attorney from the Justice Department, which actually was sitting outside, and they were seeing this Nir Hefetz, how he's being tortured. Not tortured like being slapped and beaten, but tortured by denying his medication, by denying food, by denying sleep, by putting in a flea cell, by putting together with security, with the terrorists in the same cell, so he will fear for his life, by threatening his family. All this was in court, and Nir Hefetz testified on it. But because he signed on a state witness agreement, he has to say that what he's saying now is out of his free will. Except what he's saying out of his free will is not indicting to Netanyahu, it's more indicting for the prosecution. So yes, they were aware of this situation and they let it go because for them, deposing Netanyahu was the most important thing.
Yes, yes, obviously that's the most important thing. We have a comment from Susan Cohn that Bennett signed a written pledge that he would not join a government with Lapid or the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
And I'd like to, so he duped his voters. And then I'm going to tie that together with a question from Paul Wilder. How is it possible that the government of the Jewish nation state can allow Arab representation as MK members within the Knesset? This can only lead to weakening matters within Israel and the Knesset, And this is Paul Wilder, child of Holocaust survivors.
Look, I'm not against Arabs per se. I'm not against, of course, we have other non-Jews in Israel which are extremely loyal to Israel, like the Druze. And I have personal friends who are
Yes.
Druze, I visit them and like brothers. I've been with them in the army. Some of the Arabs go to the army as well. And we have a guy named Yosef Haddad. I don't know if you know the name. He comes to the States often. I really suggest to you to try to interview him. I can send you the details. He is an Arab from Nazareth who is very, very pro-Israel, and he goes and fights for Israel all over the world. So it's not a matter of Arab, it's a matter of being non-Zionist, because these Arabs, or Druze, they say they are Zionist. They believe that Israel should be a Jewish state. All citizens should have rights, personal rights, but the national rights are the national rights of the Jews. This is a Jewish state, one state we have in the world. So I would not disqualify an Arab for being an Arab, but I do disqualify non-Zionist parties. And unfortunately, some of the Jewish parties are non-Zionist as well in this coalition. And inside one of the Arab parties, Hadash, we have a Jewish member who is vehemently non-Zionist. So, and yes, Bennett did lie to his voters. I remember it like today, sitting there, seeing him signing a document in writing in the studio of the right-wing channel, Channel 20 at the time, now Channel 14, saying, I will not sit with Yair, I will not appoint Yair Lapid as prime minister. I will not sit with the Arab party. And, you know, Bennett's worst nightmare is his archive, because on everything he says today, you can bring him something from the not far archive where he says totally opposite. And he doesn't just say it, you know, every politician to a certain degree is lying. We know that. We don't expect them to hold to their words, but there's a way to lie and there's a way to lie. If Netanyahu is being asked a question that he thinks that he may change his opinion in the future, he would say something like, let's not go into that right now, or we'll decide about it at the time. You know from the way he's saying things that he may not hold to this right now. But with Bennett, it was totally different. Bennett would look at you and say, he is lying. He is lying by saying that I will do this and this. Look at my eyes. I am not going to do that. Mark my words, I'm not going to do that. And then he went and did it. So, you know, right now he's in a position where I would say 90% of the population in Israel doesn't believe a word he says. If he says that it's day outside, I will go and open the window to check. And that's how he is being conceived in Israel. Total and complete conman. Unfortunately, I'm really sad to say this. You know, I wish I could bring you better news. But just so you know, if he says something, don't believe him. It's not going to happen unless it supports his personal goal.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have such good news on our side of the world either.
Yeah.
Helene, you're usually my co-host. I saw that you have some questions. Would you like to ask them?
Yes, thank you. One of the big criticisms that came against Netanyahu, not related to the issues of 315, but in general, one of the biggest criticisms that I spoke to many Israelis about was that he failed to groom anyone, that there was no succession in place to bring in new blood. Is this being addressed so that perhaps as more information is available to Israelis, that the government offered would be better representative of the people that are looking for it?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to realize that the Likud is the most democratic party in Israel. We have primaries. I, for one, I'm a member of the Likud, so I vote in the primaries. I get to mark 10 names out of the list of like 60 or 70. And the people who get most of the votes That's the way they are being graded and put on the list for member of parliament. So for Netanyahu to come and say this is going to be my successor would be against this democratic rule, because the goal is that the voters of the Likud will decide who is going to be the next leader. And there have been elections, primaries in the past also for the leadership. Gideon Saar, for an example, went into against Netanyahu at the end of 2019, 2020, so no, 2019, yeah, it's got confused. The end of 2019, he went as a candidate against him, he won 25%, Netanyahu got 75%, and then Gideon Saar got up and left the party and became his own party vehemently against Netanyahu. So Netanyahu, unlike the popular belief, not everybody left Netanyahu. We have a lot of good people surrounding him still. I can mention some names. Yariv Levin, very prominent member of the government, Yuval Steinitz, Amir Ohana, and a lot of new powers coming from below. They're still a little bit inexperienced, but I can see them, they're still young, and they can lead the Likud in due time. Right now, most of the Likud voters still want Netanyahu. They still want him to go back, just like I assume many Republicans in the US want President Trump to be back. Same thing, you know, we all look at it as a kind of a break to let people miss what they had and now they lost.
So we are coming up to the end of our time, and I guess I'm going to wrap up with this question. What is the end game of Project 315? Where do you expect it will lead?
So I can say that may be the only thing where we differ a little bit between us, because we all come, we have different in ages and different in background, etc. We all unite right now around the cause. The main cause, the short-term cause, is to prove as much as possible to the public that these indictments are false, that hopefully this trial, which is becoming like a farce, is going to fall apart somehow. We all are waiting anxiously. One testimonial, which is the key witness, one of the witnesses that they recruited as state witness, his name is Shlomo Filbert. And actually, just as I was getting on air, I heard the news, very, very interesting news, because Shlomo Filbert is one of these witnesses, the only one that the police has admitted that they penetrated his phone and took personal information from him. And that now has become a subject for the next discussion in court, which was postponed because one of the judges has COVID. So when that renews, that will be the discussion. And prior to this discussion, this guy, Shlomo Filbert, who's a very, very smart guy, now has a very successful polling company, came and said, I want to submit to court that I want access to all the stuff they spied on me and took from me. And that put the prosecution into a loop. On one hand, they didn't want to give it to the defense, but this is his stuff. They cannot stop him, or at least it's very hard to stop him from getting back what they stole from him illegally, obviously illegally. So he kind of put them into a pretzel. They don't know how to react to this. And that's going to be very interesting. His testimonial in general, he's very, very right-wing. He won't say it, but he's pro-Netanyahu, I'm pretty sure. Not allowed to say it. And he basically believes that all his decisions as the Minister General of the Communication Ministership was all according to to help Israel to do things right, to advance the fiber optics infrastructure. He didn't do anything because of any sort of imaginary bribe. So he's going to sit there on the witness stand in front of an attorney that doesn't know anything about the subject matter, because it's a very complicated subject matter. And it's going to be a real display that everybody here is waiting, with bated breath to hear. And maybe after that, there'll be developments. They already agreed to cancel some of the indictments in a plea bargain with Netanyahu as long as he agrees to retire from politics. They wanted to let him go with a very small fine on a bribe charge. They're going to cancel the bribe. They're going to cancel everything. Just go. And he said no, mostly because of us, people like us, not just us, but people like us that gave him power to fight forward. And you know, they did a crowdfunding when he said that when there was a talk about the plea bargain, one of the famous announcers on TV made a crowdfunding to collect money to help him with his legal expenses. He's a well-off guy, but you know, these legal expenses come to millions of dollars. So within a short period of a few days, they collected more than $1 million. It's Israel, it's a lot of money. $1.5 million, something like that. So just to show you how much support and popularity it still carries with the public, and you asked me a question, so I'll answer it. If we win, and when we win, when Netanyahu is back, I will be very happy to go back to blessed anonymity and continue doing I still have 2 companies and I still have grandchildren, and I don't look for political success, and it's not any sort of PR. Maybe some other members of the organization would like to pursue this. Good for them. I'm not. I'm also the oldest one from the group. Like, 65.
Well, you're a great spokesman for the group, and we really thank you for being here, for taking your time, for taking your evening to speak with us and to enlighten us. I have 37 more messages. If you have I am going to officially call this meeting to an end. However, if you would like us to unmute people and have a discussion following the end of this actual program, I can do that, or we can just say goodbye.
I have time if you'd like to.
Okay, so we're ending now. The recording is off.